Byblos, 1345 BCE. A man is writing a letter he has written before, not the same words, but the same plea, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, in the careful formal Akkadian that the diplomatic world required, the same opening that every letter to the Egyptian court demanded. To the king, my lord. My son, my God. At the feet of the king, my lord, I fall. His name is Ribhadda. He is the king of Byblos, a port city on the coast of what is now Lebanon, a city that has been loyal to Egypt for generations. His grandfather was loyal to Egypt. His father was loyal to Egypt. He has been loyal to Egypt his entire life. And right now that loyalty is the only thing standing between him and the army surrounding his walls. He needs soldiers, or gold to hire soldiers, or, at minimum, a reply. This is not his first letter. It is somewhere around his 30th. He knows where the Pharaoh is. Everyone knows. Akhenaten is in Akhetaten, the new city he built in the desert, 3 days' sail to the south. A city of white limestone and open temples, and a theology that has turned Egypt inside out. A city where the old gods have been silenced, and a single deity, the visible disk of the sun, receives every prayer, every offering, every official breath of devotion. It is, by all accounts, a beautiful city. Ribhadda seals the clay tablet and hands it to his messenger. He does not know that on the morning this letter arrives at the royal court, the Pharaoh will be standing in the open courtyard of his temple with his face turned toward the sun. Speaking words, he composed himself, words about light and beauty and the source of all living things. Both things are true at the same time. The king writing about soldiers in a besieged city, the Pharaoh composing poetry about the dawn. The distance between those two truths is not a distance in miles. It is something harder to measure and harder to close. And that distance, more than any battle or any building or any theological declaration, is what this story is really about. The messenger carries the tablet south toward the river. Akhenaten lifts his face to the morning light. Neither man can see the other. That is exactly the problem. Chapter 1. The World That Worked. Before you can understand what Akhenaten broke, you have to understand what he broke it from. Egypt, in 1370 BCE, was not a civilization in decline, looking for a savior. It was not a broken system waiting for someone to fix it. That framing is wrong. And it matters that it is wrong, because the story of Akhenaten only makes sense when you understand what he was working against. He was working against something that worked. The Egypt that existed before him was the most stable, most prosperous, most militarily dominant civilization on earth. The New Kingdom pharaohs of the 18th dynasty had turned an already ancient culture into something extraordinary, even by Egyptian standards. Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's own father, had ruled for nearly 40 years over an empire so wealthy that foreign kings addressed him as brother and begged him for gold, the way a desperate man begs for water. One Babylonian king wrote to him directly, "Gold in your country is like dirt. One simply picks it up." That is the Egypt Akhenaten inherited, but wealth is not the thing that made Egypt what it was. Wealth is what the system produced. The system itself was something older and deeper and more total than any economic arrangement. The Egyptians called it ma'at. There is no single English word for ma'at. Scholars translate it as truth, or justice, or cosmic balance, and all of those translations are partially right and none of them fully right, Ma'at was not a concept that Egyptians thought about. It was the water they swam in. The assumption, underneath every other assumption, the thing that made everything else make sense. When the Nile flooded each year, at exactly the right time, depositing exactly the right amount of black silt onto the farmland that fed the entire civilization. That was Ma'at. When the sun rose and set on schedule, that was Ma'at. When the Pharaoh performed the correct rituals in the correct sequence on the correct days, that was Ma'at. When a judge in a provincial court ruled fairly in a property dispute between two farmers, that was Ma'at. Everything connected. Every piece of daily life was threaded into a single fabric that ran from the movement of the stars down to the price of bread in a village market. The fabric held because the institutions that maintained it held, and the most important of those institutions, the ones sitting at the very center of the whole structure, were the temples. To call the temples religious institutions is accurate but insufficient. It is like calling the Nile a river. Technically correct, completely inadequate. The temple of Amun at Karnak, by the time Akhenaten came to power, owned more than 400,000 acres of agricultural land. It employed nearly 80,000 people. It possessed hundreds of ships, thousands of cattle, workshops producing goods that supplied not just the temple complex but entire regional economies. The wealth flowing through the major temples of Egypt was not symbolic wealth. It was operational wealth, the kind that built granaries and fed workers and paid soldiers and kept the whole complicated machine of civilization turning. The priests who administered this system were not simply men who prayed. They were managers, administrators, economists, physicians, astronomers, scribes, and judges. The temple was where you went when you were sick and needed a healer. It was where disputes were settled and contracts recorded. It was the institution that guaranteed, in concrete and practical terms, that if you worked hard and followed the rules, you would not starve. And woven through all of it, holding all of it together, was Amun. Amun was the king of the gods by the time of the New Kingdom, the hidden one, whose name meant something like the concealed. He was not the oldest of the Egyptian gods, but history had elevated him in the way history sometimes elevates things through a long accumulation of moments in which invoking his name seemed to produce results. Pharaohs had won battles under his banner. The empire had expanded while his priests prayed. He had become, over centuries, the divine patron of the whole enterprise of being Egyptian. His temples were everywhere. His name appeared on monuments in every province. His priests were among the most educated and most powerful men in the kingdom. And his festivals, which brought hundreds of thousands of people into the streets of Thebes to watch the divine statue carried in procession, were the moments when Egypt reminded itself of what it was and why it mattered. This is the world a young prince named Amenhotep grew up inside, not as an observer looking in from outside, as someone born into the absolute center of it. His father was Pharaoh, which in Egyptian theology meant his father was not merely a king but a living god, the point where the divine and the human intersected on earth. His world was the royal palace at Malkata, a city within a city on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, a complex of painted halls and ceremonial courts and private gardens that housed the administrative heart of the most powerful state on earth. He grew up surrounded by priests and scribes and officials who had spent their entire lives inside the system, who believed in it the way people believe in the air they breathe. He grew up watching his father perform the rituals that kept Ma'at in order. He grew up understanding, at a level that went below conscious thought, that every piece of this world was connected to every other piece. And somewhere in those years, he began to see the connections differently than everyone around him. There is a man in this story who never appears in any document. He has no name in any surviving record. He is a craftsman, a stonemason who worked in the construction crews that maintained and expanded the temple complexes of Thebes. He is not a significant person by any measure that history uses to decide who matters. Each morning he walked from his small house in the workers' village to the temple precinct and collected his daily ration from the storehouse that the temple of Amun maintained for its workforce. Bread, beer, vegetables, sometimes fish. The ration was not generous, but it was reliable. It had been reliable his whole life, and his father's whole life before him. The temple fed you if you worked for the temple, and nearly everyone in Thebes worked for the temple in one way or another. He did not think about theology. He did not have opinions about which God was most powerful or what the correct understanding of the divine nature was. He thought about the work in front of him, about his children, about whether the flood would be good this year. He thought about the bread that arrived every morning from the temple storehouse. That bread was ma'at, made edible. That bread was the whole system made real in the most basic possible way. He did not know, on any of those mornings, that a boy was growing up in the palace across the river who had begun to ask questions that the system had no framework for answering. He did not know what those questions were going to cost him. Neither did the boy. Chapter 2. The Prince Who Wasn't Supposed to Matter. There was supposed to be someone else. His name was Thutmose. He was the eldest son of Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye, the designated heir to the most powerful throne on earth. He was being prepared for it in the way that Egyptian royal heirs were prepared, trained in the military arts, schooled in the administrative traditions of the kingdom, introduced gradually to the ceremonial obligations that a pharaoh carried from the moment he woke to the moment he slept. He had a title, he had a role, he had a future already written, and then he died. The records do not tell us when, exactly, or how. They tell us only the result. The designated heir to the Egyptian throne was gone, and the second son, the boy who had been growing up in the background, with no particular destiny attached to his name, suddenly became the most important young man in the world. That boy was Amenhotep, the fourth of that name. We do not know what kind of child he was. The historical record does not preserve the childhoods of people who were not supposed to matter. And Amenhotep spent his early years as exactly that kind of person, a royal prince. Yes, educated, housed, protected by the full weight of the Egyptian state, but not the heir, not the one being watched, not the one whose every action carried the weight of a civilization's future. What we can do is read backward from what he became, the man who built Amarna, who wrote the great hymn to the Aten, who dismantled a 2,000-year-old religious system with the focused intensity of someone who had been thinking about it for a very long time. That man did not arrive at his convictions suddenly. He arrived at them through years of observation, of thought, of a particular kind of attention that you develop when you are close to power but not yet its center. When you can see how the machine works without yet being responsible for keeping it running. He grew up inside the temple system, not as a worshipper standing in the outer courtyards with the common people. As a royal prince, he had access to the inner chambers, the sacred spaces where priests performed the daily rituals that were, officially, the thing keeping the universe in order. He saw the mechanics of it. He saw priests carrying the divine statue through its morning rituals, washing it, dressing it, feeding it, speaking the words that maintained the connection between the human and the divine. He saw the economic machinery that supported all of this, the warehouses and the workshops and the administrative offices that turned the temple's enormous land holdings into the resources that kept everything functioning. He saw something else, too. He saw the gap between what the system claimed to be and what the system actually was. The official story of Egyptian religion was that the pharaoh was the intermediary between humanity and the gods, and the priests were the pharaoh's agents in that intermediary role. The temples existed to serve the pharaoh's divine function. The wealth of the temples was, in theory, the pharaoh's wealth, held in trust for the divine order. The practical reality was considerably more complicated. The priesthood of Amun, by the time Amenhotep IV came of age, had accumulated enough independent wealth and enough institutional power that they were not simply agents of the crown. They were a parallel power structure, one that depended on the pharaoh for legitimacy, but did not depend on him for survival. The relationship between the two had been a careful and sometimes tense negotiation for generations. A boy growing up inside that world, with a particular kind of intelligence and a particular kind of attention, would have noticed this, would have spent years turning it over, asking questions that the people around him probably found uncomfortable. His mother was Queen Tia. Tia was not born into the royal family. Her father was a provincial official, a man of influence but not of blood. She became great royal wife through Amenhotep III's personal choice rather than through dynastic arrangement, which was itself unusual. And she remained a powerful figure at court throughout her husband's long reign and well into her son's. The letters from foreign kings mention her by name, address her directly, treat her as a person whose opinion matters independently of her husband's. She was, by every account the sources provide, an extraordinary woman, intelligent, politically sophisticated, not inclined to remain in the ceremonial background that Egyptian tradition assigned to royal women. And she was, for the years when her son was growing from a boy into a young man, the most important adult in his life. What she taught him, we cannot know directly. What she showed him by her own example was that the categories the world assigned to people were not always accurate descriptions of what those people were actually capable of. She had been born outside the circle of power and had ended up at its center. She had done this not by pretending to be something she was not, but by being fully and without apology what she was. Her son was watching. By the time Amenhotep IV took the throne, probably in his late teens or early 20s, he had been watching for years. He had watched the priests. He had watched the court. He had watched the careful performance of authority that powerful institutions put on for the people who depended on them. And he had spent a great deal of time looking up, not metaphorically, literally up, at the sky, at the sun that crossed it every day with a regularity and a reliability that no human institution could match. The priests of Amun needed warehouses and administrators and political relationships to maintain their power. The sun needed nothing. It rose because it rose. It gave light and warmth and the energy that made crops grow and people live, not because it had been properly managed or correctly petitioned, but because that was what it did. Every single day, without exception, for every living thing on earth equally, a craftsman in Thebes stood in the same sunlight as a pharaoh in a palace. A farmer in the delta received the same warmth as a priest in Karnak. The sun did not have a priesthood that charged admission. It did not require an intermediary. It was simply there, visible to anyone who looked up. sustaining everything without distinction or condition. For a young man who had spent his formative years watching human institutions claim divine authority while accumulating very human wealth and very human power, this was not a small observation. It was the seed of everything that followed. He married Nefertiti. He took the throne as Amenhotep IV. He began his reign in the traditional manner, performing the expected ceremonies, working within the existing structures, giving no immediate outward sign that he was anything other than the next pharaoh in a long line of pharaohs. But he was already thinking. The priests of Amun, going about their morning rituals in the great temples of Thebes, did not yet know they were looking at a man who had decided, somewhere in the quiet years of a childhood no one was watching, that the entire structure they represented needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. They were about to find out. Chapter 3. Nefertiti, making the revolution visible. Every revolution needs two things. It needs an idea, and it needs a face. Akhenaten had the idea. What he found in Nefertiti was something that no theology, however brilliant, could manufacture on its own. He found the person who could make the idea visible, who could translate the abstract conviction burning inside him into something that an entire civilization could see and feel and understand without needing a theological education to access it. We do not know where Nefertiti came from. This is not a minor gap in the record. For the woman who would become the most depicted queen in Egyptian history, whose face would eventually become one of the most recognized images in the entire ancient world, the historical record offers almost nothing about her origins. Some scholars believe she was the daughter of Ai, a high court official who would later play a significant role in the chaos following Akhenaten's death. Others have argued she came from the royal family of Mitanni, a northern kingdom with which Egypt maintained diplomatic marriages. A few have suggested she was Egyptian-born of non-royal parentage, elevated by the same kind of personal choice that had brought Ta into the royal family a generation earlier. What the record gives us, instead of her origins, is her presence. And her presence, from the moment she appears in the historical documentation of Akhenaten's reign, is overwhelming. Walk through any major museum with an Egyptian collection and you will feel it. The art of the Amarna period, the roughly 17 years of Akhenaten's reign, is unlike anything produced before or after it in 3,000 years of Egyptian artistic tradition. The figures are elongated, sensuous, strangely human, in a way that the formal grandeur of traditional Egyptian art was specifically designed not to be. Pharaohs are shown kissing their children, royal daughters are shown climbing on their parents' laps, and at the center of almost every significant scene, standing not behind the pharaoh or beside him in the diminished scale that Egyptian convention assigned to royal wives, but next to him, equal in size, equal in ritual function, sometimes leading the ceremony herself, is Nefertiti. She drives a chariot alone in some depictions. She smites enemies in the traditional pharaonic pose that had always been reserved for the king. She stands opposite Akhenaten in worship scenes, not as his assistant, but as his counterpart, both of them receiving the descending rays of the Aten together, the divine light touching both of them simultaneously, as if the god recognized no hierarchy between them. This was not accidental. Nothing in official Egyptian royal art was accidental. Every image was a statement, a carefully considered piece of communication designed to tell the people who saw it something specific about the nature of the world and the people who ruled it. What the art of Amarna was saying about Nefertiti was this: she is not a decoration. She is not a symbol of the king's fertility or a diplomatic asset from a foreign court. She is a participant in the divine order. She is, in the visual language of the revolution Akhenaten was building, as essential to the relationship between humanity and the Aten as the Pharaoh himself. Think about what it took to put that image into the world, in a culture where artistic conventions had been fixed for 2,000 years, where the size of a figure in a painting was a direct statement of their cosmic importance, where queens had always appeared smaller than pharaohs, and pharaohs had always appeared larger than gods. Someone had to decide to do something that had never been done. Someone had to look at the visual language of an entire civilization and say, this is not sufficient for what we are trying to express. Akhenaten had the theological conviction, but conviction alone does not design a revolution's imagery. It does not choose the precise angle of a carved relief or decide which scenes will be repeated on temple walls across an entire city. It does not create, from scratch, an entirely new visual vocabulary for expressing the relationship between the human and the divine. Nefertiti helped build that vocabulary. We cannot prove this from direct documentation, because the Amarna period left us images and architecture and poetry, but very few administrative records that would tell us who made which decisions. What we can do is look at the result and ask who. In the small circle of people with the authority and the access and the intelligence to shape the official imagery of a royal revolution, was consistently, centrally, inescapably present in that imagery. The answer is the same person every time. There is a scene that appears on the walls of several Amarna period monuments, a scene so casual and so intimate and so unlike anything in the 3,000 years of Egyptian royal art surrounding it, that modern viewers sometimes assume it must be a misidentification. In this scene, Akhenaten and Nefertiti are seated together, and one of their young daughters is climbing between them, reaching up toward her mother's face, doing the thing that small children do when they want their parents' attention. Nefertiti is shown in the act of responding, turning toward the child. Her body language completely natural, completely human, completely unlike the rigid ceremonial posture of every queen who had come before her. Above them, the rays of the Aten descend, each one ending in a small human hand, touching the royal family with what the theology described as the gift of life. This image is the revolution in miniature. It says the divine source of life is not a god with human emotions and political allegiances and a priesthood that mediates access to his favor. It is a force, visible and impartial and constant, that reaches down to touch ordinary human love, ordinary human family. The completely unceremonial act of a small child climbing into her mother's lap. Someone imagined that image. Someone decided it was the right way to express what the Aten was and what it meant. Someone with the artistic sensibility to understand that the most powerful theological statement possible was not a grand ceremonial scene with hundreds of priests and elaborate regalia, but a mother turning her face toward her daughter in the sunlight. Nefertiti, was also, in ways that the official art only hints at, a political mind of the first order. The speed and the comprehensiveness of the religious revolution that Akhenaten launched in the first years of his reign, the systematic defunding of the temple economy, the redirection of royal patronage, the careful management of a court that contained people with deep investments in the old system. None of that happened through theological conviction alone. It required political intelligence of a high order, the ability to read the people in a room, and understand which ones needed to be managed carefully and which ones could be moved quickly. Nefertiti had spent her entire adult life in exactly that room. She had watched the court of Amenhotep III from close range, had seen how the existing power structures operated, had understood the specific vulnerabilities and specific loyalties of the people who made up the administrative world her husband was now responsible for governing. When Akhenaten decided to move against the temple system, he was not doing it in a vacuum. He was doing it inside a human environment of enormous complexity, and someone had to understand that environment well enough to make the moves in the right sequence. Her name appears in diplomatic correspondence from foreign courts in a way that is unusual for Egyptian queens of this period. The king of Mitanni writes to her directly. The king of Babylon acknowledges her. These were rulers who dealt with the Egyptian court constantly and who understood from long experience, who in that court actually held influence. They did not write to Nefertiti out of courtesy. They wrote to her because they had determined that writing to her was worth their time. The revolution of Akhenaten and the revolution of Nefertiti were not the same revolution running in parallel. They were the same revolution, built by two people who understood different but equally essential parts of what building it required. He understood the theology. He understood, at a level that went bone deep, what was wrong with the old system and what the new one needed to say about the nature of the divine. She understood the humans. She understood what it took to make a revolution, not just theologically coherent but humanly visible, emotionally accessible, aesthetically compelling enough to ask people to reorganize their entire understanding of the sacred around it. At the end of Amenhotep IV's fourth year on the throne, he changed his name. Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, became Akhenaten, meaning the effective spirit of the Aten. The name change was not a private spiritual decision. It was a public declaration, carved into stone and sent through official channels to every part of the kingdom. The Pharaoh was no longer the servant of Amun. He was the servant of something else entirely. On the same day, or close to it, Nefertiti's name was extended. She had always been Nefertiti. The beautiful one has come. Now she became Nefertiti. Beautiful are the beauties of the Aten. The beautiful one has come. Her name was bound to the theology. She was not simply a queen watching from the side. She was woven into the revolution's identity at the level of language itself. Two names, one declaration, one revolution with two authors. The priests of Amun read the official announcement and understood exactly what it meant. The budget cuts had already started. The name change confirmed what the budget cuts had suggested. This was not a temporary shift in royal religious preference. This was something new, and the man who had made it was not doing it halfway. And the woman standing next to him was not going to let him. Chapter 4. The War Without Swords. No army marched on the temples of Amun. No soldiers broke down the doors of Karnak. No battle was fought in the streets of Thebes between the forces of the old religion and the forces of the new one. There was no single dramatic moment when the world changed and everyone present knew it had changed. What happened was quieter than that, and in many ways more devastating than any military campaign could have been. An army can be defeated. A garrison can be overwhelmed. A city can be retaken. But when the mechanism of change is administrative, when the weapon is a reed stylus, pressing numbers into clay accounting tablets, when the revolution arrives, not as a sword, but as a revised budget, there is no battlefield to fight on, and no clear moment of victory to reverse. Akhenaten understood this with the precision of someone who had grown up watching how power actually operated. The first moves were financial. The temples of Egypt were not funded by voluntary donations from the faithful. They were funded by the state, through a complex system of royal endowments that had been building and accumulating for centuries. Pharaohs gave land to the temples. They gave cattle. They gave the labor of workers. They gave a share of the tribute that poured in from the empire's subject territories. In exchange, the temples performed the rituals that maintained Ma'at, educated the scribes who ran the administration, and provided the social services, the food distribution, the medical care, the legal functions that kept the population alive and functioning. Akhenaten stopped the endowments, not all at once, not with a single sweeping decree that would have been legible as an act of war and might have produced a unified response. The reduction was gradual at first, a tightening here, a redirection there, the kind of administrative adjustment that looks like budget management until you step back far enough to see the pattern. And the pattern was unmistakable. Resources that had been flowing to the temples of the traditional gods were being redirected to the royal court, to the new construction projects beginning to take shape in the desert, to the cult of the Aten, which required its own infrastructure, its own personnel, its own supply chains. The priests of Amun watched their income shrink and their influence contract, and they did what people in that position almost always do first. They waited. They assumed this was a temporary disruption, a young king's enthusiasm that would moderate with time and experience. They had seen kings come and go. They had managed difficult pharaohs before. The institution of the priesthood was older than any individual king and had outlasted worse challenges than a theological preference. They were wrong about the temporary part. The second move was harder to manage than the first, because it was not about money. It was about names. In Egyptian theology, a name was not a label. A name was a portion of a being's essence, as real and as vital as the physical body. To speak a name was to activate the thing it named. To carve a name in stone was to give it a kind of immortality, a permanence that outlasted any individual lifetime. And to erase a name, to chisel it off a wall or fill it with plaster, was not simply vandalism. It was an act of metaphysical violence, an attempt to unmake the thing the name represented. Akhenaten sent workers across Egypt to unmake Amun. Teams of men with chisels climbed scaffolding on the walls of temples and palaces and monuments that had been standing for centuries and cut the name of Amun out of the stone. They did this systematically, methodically, with the focused efficiency of a state operation, rather than the random fury of a mob. The name of Amun disappeared from Karnak and from Luxor and from the smaller temples in the provinces. It disappeared from private monuments and public inscriptions. It disappeared. In one of the more striking expressions of how personal this campaign was, from the name of Akhenaten's own father, whose throne name contained the word Amun, and whose memory was therefore collateral damage in his son's theological war. The other gods were not spared. Osiris, whose mythology was woven into the Egyptian understanding of death and resurrection and the afterlife, was targeted. Isis, whose cult ran through every level of Egyptian society, from the royal court to the most remote village. The entire elaborate pantheon that the Egyptians had spent millennia developing to explain the world, to comfort the dying, to give meaning to suffering and structure to hope, was being systematically removed from the official record. This is the point where it is easy to misread what was happening and what it cost. It is easy, from the distance of 3,000 years, to read this as a political purge, as one powerful faction eliminating another, as the kind of institutional consolidation that ambitious rulers have always pursued. And at one level it was exactly that. The Temple of Amun was a rival power center, and Akhenaten was reducing its power. The political logic is clear enough, but the people inside the system were not experiencing a political purge. They were experiencing something that had no framework in their world. Because their world had never imagined this particular thing happening. Think about what it meant to be a priest of Osiris in Thebes in the 5th year of Akhenaten's reign. Your entire life had been organized around a set of rituals and beliefs and professional obligations that connected you to a tradition going back further than anyone could remember. Your father had been a priest. His father had been a priest. The knowledge you carried, the specific words of the funerary rites, the precise sequence of the offering ceremonies, the astronomical calculations that governed the sacred calendar. All of it had been passed down through your family and your institution across generations. It was not simply your job. It was your identity, your community, your understanding of what death meant and what came after it. And now a pharaoh was telling you that the God you served did not exist in the way you had understood him to exist, that the rituals you performed were not maintaining the cosmic order, that the afterlife you had spent your life preparing people for was not available through the channels you had always used to access it. There was no word for this in the Egyptian language, because the situation had never arisen before. Among the people who felt the change most immediately and most concretely was the man from chapter 1, the stonemason in Thebes. He arrived at the temple storehouse one morning and found the distribution reduced, then reduced again the following week. The staff running the storehouse had the specific expression of people managing a situation they did not create and could not explain and had not been given authority to resolve. The bread still came. For a while. Because systems have enough inertia to keep running even as their funding dries up. But it came in smaller quantities, with less reliability, with the specific anxiety of something that everyone involved could see was running down. He was not a theological person. He was a man who needed to eat, and whose children needed to eat, and whose understanding of how the world worked had always included the assumption that the temple would be there to provide what it had always provided. That assumption was being removed from underneath him, and no one had asked his opinion about it. Meanwhile, in the royal court, Akhenaten was working with the focused energy of a man who believes he is correcting a mistake that has been running for too long. The administrative machinery of the Aten cult was expanding. New priests were being appointed. Men whose loyalty was to the king rather than to any institutional tradition. New ceremonies were being designed. A new liturgy was being written, with Akhenaten himself as its primary author, and on the drawing tables of the royal architects, the plans for something unprecedented were taking shape. A city, not a renovation of an existing city or an expansion of a palace complex, a completely new city, built on ground where nothing had ever been built before, dedicated entirely to the Aten, designed from its first stone to embody the theology that Akhenaten was constructing. It would be called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. The priests of Amun were still waiting for this to moderate. The workers were already loading the barges. Chapter 5. Akhetaten, the city. Built from conviction, there is a stretch of desert on the east bank of the Nile, roughly halfway between Thebes in the south and Memphis in the north, where the cliffs pull back from the river in a long curve, creating a natural bay of flat ground, several miles wide and several miles deep. The land is barren. There is no natural water source beyond the Nile itself. There is no shade. In summer, the heat coming off the limestone cliffs turns the air into something close to a physical force, pressing down on everything beneath it with the specific indifference of a landscape that has no interest in human survival. There was nothing there. No village, no temple, no history, no memory. That was exactly why Akhenaten chose it. He came to this place in his 5th year as Pharaoh, sailing north from Thebes with a royal flotilla. And when he stepped off his boat and looked at the empty ground between the river and the cliffs, he saw something that no one else present was seeing. He saw a city. He saw the city that the Aten had been waiting for, a place unspoiled by the presence of any other god, a blank page on which a new understanding of the divine could be written without the accumulated weight of 2,000 years of different theology pressing through from underneath. He performed a ceremony. He rode his chariot across the flat ground in a great arc, marking the boundaries of what would be built. He swore an oath, and had that oath carved into a series of boundary stelae, massive stone tablets set into the cliffs around the perimeter of the site, so that the oath would be permanent and visible and undeniable. The text of those oaths survives. It is one of the few places in the historical record where we hear something that sounds like Akhenaten's actual voice, rather than the formal language of official proclamation. He swore that he would build the city here and nowhere else. He swore that he would not expand its boundaries beyond what he was marking that day, even if the Aten himself commanded him to do so. He swore that if he died outside this city, his body would be brought back to be buried here, and then, in a passage that stays with you once you have read it, he swore the same oath on behalf of Nefertiti, and then, on behalf of each of his daughters, by name, he was binding his entire family to this place, to this vision, to this bet that the Aten required a city and that he was the one to build it. Read those words carefully, and you hear something underneath the theology. A man making promises with a completeness that goes beyond administrative declaration. A man who needs the oath to be total because the conviction behind it is total, and because somewhere, perhaps below conscious thought, he understands that a vision this large requires a commitment, this absolute, to have any chance of surviving contact with the world. The construction began almost immediately. What followed over the next 2 years was one of the most remarkable feats of organized human effort in the ancient world, and also one of the least examined in terms of what it actually cost the people who made it happen. Akhetaten, which later generations would call Amarna, rose from bare desert into a functioning city of perhaps 20,000 to 50,000 inhabitants with a speed that strains credibility, even when you accept it as historical fact. The scale of the operation required to do this is difficult to comprehend. Stone had to be quarried from the cliffs and transported to the building sites. Thousands of workers had to be fed and housed on a site that had no existing infrastructure to support them. Architects and engineers had to design and build simultaneously, making decisions in the field that in normal circumstances would have gone through years of planning. Supply chains stretching hundreds of miles had to be established and maintained for materials that did not exist locally. In recent decades, archaeologists have excavated the cemeteries of the workers who built Amarna. What they found there complicates the picture considerably. The skeletons show a population under serious physical stress. Spinal compression fractures at rates significantly higher than comparable populations. The signature injury of people carrying heavy loads repeatedly over long periods. Childhood growth interruptions recorded in the bones, indicating periods of malnutrition during development. Average lifespans shorter than those found in other Egyptian sites of the same period. A significant proportion of the burials are of young adults, people in their late teens and 20s whose bodies gave out before they reached middle age. These are the people who built the city for the God of Light. They did not leave written records of their experience. They left their bones. And their bones are a kind of testimony that no official inscription was designed to preserve. The city they built was, by any measure, extraordinary. At its center was the great temple of the Aten, and it was unlike any temple Egypt had ever seen. The traditional Egyptian temple was a progression of darkness. You moved from the sunlit outer courtyard through increasingly smaller and darker spaces until you reached the innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, where the divine presence resided in shadow, accessible only to the highest priests. The architecture was designed to create mystery, to separate the sacred from the ordinary by the medium of darkness itself. The great temple at Amarna had no roof. The sanctuary was open to the sky. The divine presence was not hidden in darkness. It was the light itself, falling directly from the sun onto the offering tables, touching the worshippers and the priests and the ritual objects and the Pharaoh himself, without any architectural barrier between the source and the recipient. You stood in the temple of the Aten, and you stood in the Aten simultaneously. There was no inside and outside. There was no hidden chamber where the real divine presence was kept away from ordinary eyes. This was theology made into architecture. The Aten did not require a room. The Aten required only sky. Beyond the great temple, the city spread out along the Nile, in a pattern that archaeologists have spent decades mapping. There was a smaller temple for daily rituals. There was the royal palace, a complex of painted halls and private apartments and ceremonial courts. There were the houses of the officials and courtiers who had followed the court from Thebes, ranging from substantial villas with gardens to smaller dwellings reflecting the more modest status of their occupants. And there were the ordinary neighborhoods. This is what surprises most people when they read about Amarna carefully. It was not only a ceremonial center or a royal enclave. People lived there, bakers and brewers and potters and weavers and scribes and soldiers and the whole population of supporting trades that any human community requires. They had houses with courtyards. They had small shrines in their homes. They cooked meals and raised children and argued with their neighbors about property lines. In the corners of those houses, tucked into wall niches and hidden beneath floor stones, archaeologists have found something that tells you a great deal about the difference between official theology and lived human experience. Small figurines, household gods, Bes, the protective deity of childbirth and the home, Teweret, the hippopotamus goddess, who guarded pregnant women, figures of Hathor and Isis, goddesses whose cults were woven into the most intimate parts of Egyptian domestic life, all of them officially forbidden, all of them present anyway. The people who lived in Amarna were not organizing resistance movements or planning a counter-revolution. They were doing what people always do when an official ideology does not fully cover the territory of actual human experience. They were finding the gaps and filling them with what they needed. A woman going into labor in Amarna in the 9th year of Akhenaten's reign did not want a theological abstraction about the source of all life. She wanted Tawret, the familiar hippopotamus goddess who had been protecting mothers through childbirth for as long as anyone could remember, whose image her mother had kept and her grandmother had kept, whose presence in the room felt like protection in a way that a sun disk with rays ending in small hands did not. She kept the figurine small. She kept it hidden. She was not alone. The official city and the lived city occupied the same physical space and operated by different rules. Akhenaten, standing in his open-roofed temple with his face lifted to the light, seems not to have fully grasped the distance between them. Or perhaps he grasped it and believed it was temporary, believed that the new theology, given time and the right expression, would eventually fill the spaces that the old religion had occupied in people's lives. He was building a city where that transformation could happen. He had given it the architecture of openness, of directness, of the divine made visible and accessible rather than hidden and mediated. What he had not fully accounted for was how long it takes to change, not what people officially believe, but what they reach for when they are frightened. The boundary stelae stood in the cliffs around the city, the oath carved into them still legible, the promise still binding. He would not expand the city's limits. He would not leave. He had sworn it in front of the God he was building the city for. Outside those boundaries, the empire continued to operate with the imperfect, complicated, human machinery that empires have always required. Soldiers patrolled borders. Administrators collected taxes. Diplomats managed relationships with kingdoms whose names Akhenaten rarely mentioned in his poetry. And in Byblos, Rib-Hadda was composing another letter. Chapter 6. The Great Hymn, What He Got Right. Stop here for a moment. Before the empire, before the letters, before the things that went wrong, and the costs that mounted, and the judgment that history would eventually deliver on this man, and what he did with 17 years of absolute power. Stop here and read what he wrote, because if you move through the story of Akhenaten without spending real time inside the great hymn to the Aten, you will miss the thing that makes the whole story matter. You will have the biography of a disruptive king and a failed revolution. And that is a perfectly adequate historical narrative. But it is not the reason that 3,500 years later, people are still writing books about this man and arguing about what he meant and whether he was a visionary or a catastrophe, or both at the same time. The reason is the poem. The Great Hymn to the Aten is the longest and most complete expression of Akhenaten's theology that survives. It was found carved on the wall of a tomb belonging to a high official named I, one of the most important men at the Amarna court. Whether Akhenaten wrote every word himself, or whether it emerged from a circle of court poets working under his direction, is a question scholars have debated without resolution. What is not debated is that it reflects his thinking, his voice, his way of seeing the relationship between the divine and the living world. It begins with the sunrise. The poem opens with darkness, with the world lying still and silent, while the sun is absent, and then describes the moment of dawn with a vividness that crosses 35 centuries without losing a single degree of its original warmth. When the sun rises, everything wakes. Birds lift from their nests with wings spread in greeting. Cattle stand in their fields. People wash their faces and go to work. The Nile fills with boats. Flowers open toward the light. Fish leap in the water beneath the surface. This is not unusual religious poetry. Every culture that has ever existed has written about the sunrise. What is unusual is what Akhenaten says next. He says that all of this, every living thing waking in the morning light, belongs to the same moment, not to different gods managing different domains, not to the complex bureaucracy of divine power that the traditional Egyptian pantheon described, where Ra managed the sky, and Osiris managed the dead, and Isis managed birth, and Set managed chaos, and each domain had its specialist and its ritual requirements and its priestly intermediaries, to one source, one movement, one light that falls on all of it simultaneously, and without preference and without condition. The poem lists the creatures that receive this light with a comprehensiveness that feels almost scientific in its attention. The chick breaking out of its shell, the fish in the deepest part of the river, the mouse in the grass, the bird in the furthest country, and then comes the image that stops you, a foreign man, speaking a language no Egyptian understands, living under a sky that looks the same as the sky over Amarna, receiving the same light. The Akhetaten does not belong to Egypt. Think about what it means for an Egyptian pharaoh to put that image into an official religious text. Egyptian theology had always located the divine center of the universe squarely inside Egyptian geography. The gods had Egyptian names and Egyptian temples and Egyptian priests who maintained their connection to the human world through specifically Egyptian rituals. The divine and the national were the same thing. And the same thing pointed inward, toward the Nile, toward Thebes, toward the inner sanctum of the temple, where the divine presence resided in specifically Egyptian darkness. Akhenaten looked up at the sun and saw something different. He saw a source that did not distinguish. That did not belong to one people or one place or one priestly tradition with the correct access codes. A source that was simply present, equally and simultaneously, for everything alive under it. The poem continues into one of its most extraordinary passages, describing a baby being formed in the womb. Long before any modern understanding of embryology, Akhenaten wrote about the development of a child inside its mother with an attention to biological process that is genuinely startling. The seed becoming a person, the breath entering the new body, the moment of birth when the child first opens its mouth and receives the air of the world, and the source of all of this, the poem insists, is the same light that warms the chick and the fish and the foreign man speaking his incomprehensible language. Life is one thing. Its source is one thing. The diversity of its expression does not change the unity of what underlies it. Now hold that idea and set it next to what it was replacing, the Egyptian afterlife, as the traditional religion described it, was one of the most elaborate systems for managing the fear of death that any civilization has ever produced. The deceased had to navigate a complex journey through the underworld, face a tribunal of gods, have their heart weighed against the feather of Mart, correctly answer a long series of ritual questions, and successfully complete a passage that required specialized knowledge, available in its most complete form only through the funerary texts that the priests could provide and that cost money to obtain. Death, in traditional Egyptian theology, was a process that needed professional management. And like any process that needs professional management, it was more navigable if you had resources and connections and knew the right people. The Akhetaten had no afterlife mythology. This is not a minor theological gap. It is a fundamental restructuring of what religion is for. The traditional gods offered Egyptians something specific and irreplaceable, a framework for understanding death and a set of tools for surviving it. The priests of Osiris were not simply performing rituals. They were providing a service that people needed desperately and that had no secular substitute. They were telling people that death was not the end, that the journey through it could be navigated, that the love and the effort and the goodness of a human life were not simply extinguished when the body stopped breathing. Akhenaten replaced this with light, with the observation that the sun rises and everything lives, with the assertion that the source of life is present and visible and does not require a specialized intermediary to access, with a theology whose beauty was genuine and whose emotional range was, by the standard of what it was being asked to replace, drastically incomplete. You cannot weigh a sunrise against the weight of grief for someone you have lost. And yet, read the poem again. Read the passage about the baby forming in the womb, about the moment of first breath, about the fish leaping and the birds lifting and the world waking in the same light that touches everything without distinction. Read it not as a theological document or a political statement, but as a piece of writing by a human being who looked at the world and felt, genuinely and deeply, that what he was seeing was too beautiful and too unified to be the product of a committee of competing divine personalities, each managing their separate domain. He was not wrong about that. Whatever else you decide about Akhenaten, whatever judgment you reach about his methods and the costs he imposed and the ways his vision failed to account for the full range of human need, you cannot read the great hymn and conclude that the man who wrote it was not seeing something real. He was seeing the world with a clarity that broke through the accumulated conventions of 2,000 years and arrived at an observation that would recur, in different forms and different languages, across the subsequent history of human religious thought, that there is one source, that it does not play favorites, that the light which warms a child in Egypt warms a child in Babylon and a child in a land whose name the Egyptians did not know, and that this fact means something about the nature of what that source is. There is one more thing to say here before the story moves forward into the parts that are harder to defend. Psalm 104 of the Hebrew Bible shares a remarkable structural resemblance to the great hymn to the Akhetaten. Both poems describe the world coming alive in morning light. Both describe the rhythm of day and night, activity and rest, as their structural spine. Both describe the animals of field and forest. Both describe the sea and its creatures. Both locate the source of all life in a single divine power, whose generosity sustains every living thing without condition. The parallels are not vague, thematic similarities of the kind that might arise independently from two poets describing the same natural world. They are specific enough and numerous enough that generations of scholars have asked whether there is a connection. The honest answer is that no one knows. The two texts are separated by several centuries, and the channels through which ideas traveled in the ancient Near East were complex and imperfectly documented. It is possible that Hebrew poets encountered Amarna period theological ideas through the cultural networks of the Bronze Age world. It is possible that both texts are independently drawing on a common fund of ancient Near Eastern religious imagery. It is possible that the similarities are the result of two traditions looking at the same sky and arriving at similar conclusions. What is not possible is to read both texts side by side and pretend the resemblance is not there. The full implications of that resemblance belong at the end of this story, when the question of what Akhenaten's theology eventually became is finally examined. Here it is enough to say this: the poem he wrote in his city in the desert was not a document that stayed in the desert. Ideas move, especially ideas that are genuinely seeing something. In the royal palace at Amarna, Akhenaten composed or presided over the composition of the poem that would become the great hymn. Outside the palace, in the open-roofed temple, the morning ceremonies were being performed. In the city around the temple, the people of Amarna were going about the business of their days, keeping their small household figurines hidden in the corners of their houses, filling the gaps that the official theology left open with the older, more familiar presences that had always been there when they were needed. And in the offices of the royal chancery, a new shipment of clay tablets had arrived from the north. Rib Hadda had written again. Chapter 7. The Letters from the Edge of the World. In the summer of 1887, a woman digging for fertilizer in the fields near a village called Tel El Amarna put her hand into the earth and felt something hard. She pulled out a clay tablet covered in strange marks. Then another. Then another. She had no way of knowing what she had found. She sold the tablets to dealers, who sold them to other dealers. And for a period of months, the tablets moved through the antiquities market, being handled by people who did not recognize their significance. some of them breaking in transit, some of them lost entirely, before scholars with the right training finally got their eyes on what remained. What remained was 382 clay tablets, written in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the Bronze Age world, dating to the reigns of Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten, addressed to the Egyptian royal court from kings and vassal rulers across the Near East. They were the diplomatic archive of Amarna, correspondence that had been sitting in the earth for 3,200 years, waiting. The Amarna letters, as they came to be known, changed the way historians understood the ancient world. They revealed a Bronze Age international system of surprising sophistication, a network of kingdoms connected by trade and diplomacy and royal marriage, and the constant negotiation of power that has characterized human political life in every era. The great kings of Babylon and Assyria and Mitanni and Hatti wrote to the Pharaoh as equals, addressing him as brother, sending gifts, requesting gold, arranging the marriages of their daughters into the Egyptian royal family with the careful language of men who understood that the relationship they were managing was worth managing carefully. And then there were the other letters, the letters from the smaller rulers, the mayors and governors and petty kings of the city-states along the Levantine coast, the territories that Egypt considered its sphere of influence, its imperial periphery, the places where Egyptian power was asserted, not through direct occupation, but through the presence of Egyptian officials and the expectation of Egyptian support when it was needed. Rib-Hadda of Byblos wrote more of these letters than anyone else in the archive. Scholars have counted somewhere between 60 and 70 surviving tablets from him, though the original number was almost certainly higher before the archive was broken up and partially lost in 1887. 60 to 70 letters, spanning years, to a court that responded inadequately, intermittently, and finally, not at all. Read them in sequence, and you are reading something that feels less like diplomatic correspondence and more like a man talking to a wall. The vocabulary stays formal, because formal language is all he has available to him. But underneath the careful Akkadian, underneath the ritual prostrations and the invocations of the Pharaoh as the sun and the breath of life, you can feel the pressure building with every tablet. The first letters are measured. There are problems in the region. Hostile forces are disrupting the trade routes. His neighbors are unreliable. He needs a garrison of soldiers, or gold to hire soldiers, or, at minimum, some signal from the Egyptian court that his situation has been noted. The later letters are different. To the king, my lord, my son, Rib-Hadda, your servant, writes, "Why have you neglected your land? I have written to the palace, but you have paid no attention to my words. The city of Gubla is like a bird in a trap. There is no food. There is no water. All the mayors of the cities have abandoned me. If no help comes this year, I will die." He did not die that year. He survived long enough to write more letters. But eventually, after the death of Akhenaten and the collapse of the Amarna administration and the slow unraveling of the structures that had given his appeals their destination, Rib-Hadda was driven from Byblos by his own brother and killed. The city he had spent years trying to protect fell under the control of forces that the Egyptian Empire, during the years when it might have acted, had not acted to stop. Now here is where the temptation is to say something simple, to say that Akhenaten was writing poetry while his empire burned, to draw a straight line between the great hymn and the fall of Byblos and present it as cause and effect. The truth is more complicated and in some ways more interesting than that. The Egyptian empire did not collapse under Akhenaten. Byblos did not fall while he was king. The letters from the archive show a court that was functioning, that was receiving correspondence, that was sometimes responding, that was engaged in the ordinary business of imperial administration throughout the Amarna period. What the letters show is not absence but inadequacy, not silence but insufficient response. Some of Ribhada's letters received answers. Some of the crises he described were addressed, partially and late, in the way that distant bureaucracies address crises, when the crisis has to compete for attention with other crises and with the ordinary demands of running a large and complex state. What the letters reveal is a pattern, not a deliberate abandonment of imperial responsibility, but something more human and more common than deliberate abandonment, a pattern of attention directed elsewhere. The Egyptian court during the Amarna period was consumed with something: the theological revolution, the building of the new city, the administrative reorganization required to redirect the resources of a kingdom away from a 2,000-year-old institutional structure and toward an entirely new one. All of this required an enormous amount of the cognitive and administrative capacity of the people at the top of the Egyptian state. Bureaucracies have limited bandwidth. When a king is redesigning the fundamental religious and administrative architecture of his kingdom, the bandwidth available for monitoring the situation of a vassal city on the Levantine coast is necessarily reduced. This is not a moral failure in the simple sense. It is a structural one. It is what happens when a very large project consumes the attention of the people responsible for managing a very large system. The letters pile up. The responses slow down. The vassal in Byblos writes again, more urgently, and the letter sits on a table in the chancery at Amarna, where a scribe will get to it when he gets to it, because there are 40 other letters from 40 other parts of the empire also waiting, and the king is in the temple this morning and will not be available until this afternoon. Consider the physical reality of the situation. In the chancery at Amarna, on any given day in the middle years of Akhenaten's reign, there were tablets arriving from across the Near East, routine administrative correspondence, reports from provincial officials, requests from vassal rulers, diplomatic exchanges with the great kings, the entire clay flow of managing an empire that stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile to the borders of what is now Turkey, and somewhere in that same complex, possibly audible through the walls of the Chancery building on a still morning, Akhenaten was composing or reviewing or refining the theological texts that were the primary project of his reign. Both things were happening in the same building. The question is not whether Akhenaten cared about Byblos. The question is whether any human mind, even an exceptional one, can fully attend to both the transcendent and the practical simultaneously. Whether the same person who is genuinely, deeply, completely convinced that he has seen the truth about the nature of the divine can also maintain the patient, unglamorous, detail-oriented attention that keeping an empire together requires. History offers very few examples of people who managed it. There is a specific kind of blindness that comes with genuine vision. It is the blindness of focus, the narrowing of peripheral attention that happens when the central thing is so compelling and so certain and so real that the peripheral things become not invisible exactly, but less urgent, less present, less the kind of thing that makes you stop what you are doing and respond today rather than tomorrow. Ribhada wrote 60 to 70 letters. The Great Hymn to the Aten is one of the most beautiful religious poems in the history of human civilization. Both of these things are true. They sit next to each other in the historical record without resolving into a simple verdict. without giving you a clean answer about what the man who produced one and failed to adequately respond to the other was doing wrong, or whether doing wrong is even the right category for what this was. What they give you is a portrait, a king with a genuinely extraordinary mind and a genuinely extraordinary vision, building a genuinely extraordinary thing in a genuinely extraordinary city, while the world outside the city's boundaries continued to operate by the ordinary rules of power and need and desperation that have always governed human affairs. The sun rose over Amarna every morning and filled the open courtyards of the great temple with light. In Byblos, Rib-Hadda watched the same sun rise over walls that were holding for now, but that would not hold forever without help. He picked up his stylus. He pressed it into the wet clay. He began again. Chapter 8. Nefertiti, the missing half. Start with the face. A painted limestone bust, 50 centimeters tall, found in 1912 by a German archaeological team excavating the workshop of a sculptor named Thutmose in the southern part of the Amarna site. The workshop had been abandoned when Amarna was evacuated, its contents left behind in the hasty departure of a court that knew it was not coming back. Among the objects in the workshop were numerous sculptors' models, practice pieces, reference casts, the working materials of an artist who produced official images for the royal court, and one piece that was not a model or a practice cast. The identity was confirmed by the inscription on the base, Nefertiti. The neck is long and elegant. The cheekbones are high. The features have a precision that suggests the sculptor was working from life rather than from convention. The headdress is the distinctive flat-topped blue crown that appears on Nefertiti in the official imagery of Amarna. One eye is complete. The iris is inlaid. The details finished. The gaze, present and direct, in the way that finished Egyptian sculpture is present and direct. The other eye socket is empty. There is no definitive explanation for why the bust was never completed. The most straightforward answer is that it was a workshop reference model, never intended to be a finished artwork for presentation. The missing eye may simply mean that the inlay had not yet been inserted when the workshop was abandoned in the final days of Amarna. But the image it creates is the one that stays with you long after every historical explanation has been absorbed. The most famous face from the most famous period of ancient Egyptian history, looking out at you with one eye that sees and one eye that does not, finished on one side, waiting on the other, a portrait interrupted at the moment of completion by something that did not allow the sculptor to come back and finish what he had started. It has been in Berlin since 1913, in the Neues Museum, behind glass, in a room designed to display it to maximum effect. Egypt has requested its return many times. Germany has declined each time. The diplomatic argument continues in the slow registers of institutional negotiation. The face does not weigh in on the argument. It looks straight ahead, as it has looked straight ahead for 3,300 years, with its completed eye and its empty socket, present and composed and attending to something that is not in the frame. Year 12 of Akhenaten's reign. Something changes. It does not announce itself. There is no official declaration, no public ceremony, no document that says, from this point forward, the person who has stood at the center of everything this revolution has been will no longer be visible. The change is legible only in retrospect, in the pattern of what stops appearing rather than in any single moment of absence. Nefertiti disappears from the record. Not completely, not all at once, not in a way that leaves a clean edge you can point to and say, here is where she ends. But the woman who had been depicted on temple walls and palace reliefs and official monuments with a frequency and a prominence that had no precedent in Egyptian royal history. The woman whose name had been woven into the theology itself, whose image had been the human face of the revolution, begins to fade from the official documentation of the court. The scenes that had defined the Amarna visual program, the royal family, together, under the rays of the Aten, the intimate domestic images of parents with children, the ceremonial scenes, with Nefertiti standing equal to the pharaoh in size and ritual function, become less frequent, then rare, then absent, and the historical record, which has been full of her presence for 12 years, goes quiet. Scholars have been arguing about what this silence means for as long as they have known it existed. The arguments have not resolved, and they are unlikely to resolve, because the evidence is insufficient to support a definitive conclusion in any direction. What it does support is a careful accounting of the possibilities. The first possibility is the simplest. She died. Egypt, during the middle years of Akhenaten's reign, was touched by plague. The evidence for this comes from multiple sources, references in the Amarna letters to disease spreading through the region, analysis of remains from the Amarna cemeteries suggesting elevated mortality, and the documented deaths of at least 2 of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's daughters during this period. The ancient world killed people with a casual efficiency that modern life has largely insulated us from. And queens were not exempt from the diseases that moved through populations without regard for status. If Nefertiti died in approximately year 12, the absence from the record is explained. The grief, visible in the subtle darkening of the official imagery and the increasingly rigid quality of the late Amarna religious program, is explained. The sense that something essential was removed from the revolution at its midpoint is explained. It is the cleanest explanation. It does not require us to imagine political conflict, or personal rupture, or theological disagreement. It requires only what the ancient world delivered constantly and without apology. The second possibility is more complicated. She did not die. She was separated from Akhenaten, either by his choice or by hers. For reasons that the surviving evidence hints at but does not confirm, there is archaeological evidence, disputed and debated but not dismissible, for a royal residence in the northern part of the Amarna site that may have been occupied independently from the main palace complex. If Nefertiti was living there separately from Akhenaten, the reasons could range across a wide spectrum. Political disagreement about the direction of the revolution, personal estrangement of the kind that marriages under extreme pressure sometimes produce, a deliberate administrative arrangement giving her a separate sphere of authority. The third possibility is the one that, if true, would make Nefertiti's story not an ending but a transformation. She became pharaoh. Between the death of Akhenaten and the reign of Tutankhamun, there is a figure in the Egyptian record called Nefertiti, a pharaoh who ruled for a short period and whose identity has never been definitively established. The name is one that Nefertiti had carried as part of her extended titulary since early in Akhenaten's reign. Some scholars have argued, with evidence that is circumstantial but carefully assembled, that Nefertiti, the pharaoh, and Nefertiti, the queen, are the same person. That what looks like a disappearance from the record is actually a change of role, a woman moving from one kind of power to another. If this is true, then Nefertiti did not fade. She rose. She took the throne after her husband's death and governed Egypt in her own right, as the last defender of a revolution she had helped build, trying to hold together what the years had been pulling apart. The evidence does not allow us to choose with confidence among these 3 possibilities, but here is what the evidence does allow. Whatever happened to Nefertiti in year 12, something changed in the texture of what followed. The art of the late Amarna period has a different quality from the art of the early years. The intimate human warmth that had characterized the imagery of the revolution, the scenes of family life and physical affection, and the divine light touching ordinary moments, diminishes. The official imagery becomes more formal, more rigid, more focused on the theology in its abstract form rather than in its human expression. A revolution that began with two people had become, whatever the reason, a single person's project. And a single person, even one with Akhenaten's extraordinary conviction and extraordinary will, is not the same thing as two people who see the same thing and build it together. Think about what Nefertiti had provided that theology alone could not provide. She had been the person who understood the humans inside the revolution, the one who could read a room of courtiers and understand which ones were performing loyalty and which ones were calculating alternatives, the one who had given the abstract certainty of Akhenaten's vision its human face, its emotional warmth, its accessibility to people who would never engage with the theology directly, but who could respond to the image of a mother turning toward her daughter in the morning light. Without her, the revolution had its convictions intact. What it was losing, slowly and then more visibly, was its capacity to feel the distance between what the official program said and what the people inside it actually needed. The city was still there. The temple was still open to the sky. The rays of the Akhetaten still descended in the morning and touched everything they reached. But the bust in the sculptor's workshop had one eye complete and one eye waiting, and the sculptor, when he left Amarna for the last time, did not come back to finish it. Chapter 9. Darkness. Inside the light. The Akhetaten did not stop the plague. This is a simple sentence, and it contains the most difficult problem that Akhenaten's theology ever faced. Not the political opposition of the priesthood, which was manageable as long as the crown controlled the resources. Not the diplomatic strain visible in the Amarna letters, which was a structural failure of governance rather than a failure of faith. Not even the loss of Nefertiti, whose absence reshaped the revolution without stopping it. The plague was different. The plague was the kind of event that a theology either survives or does not. And the way it survives tells you everything about what that theology is actually made of. The disease that moved through the Near East during the middle and later years of Akhenaten's reign is documented in enough sources to be accepted as historical fact. The Amarna letters reference it. Hittite records from the same period describe a devastating epidemic that their own historians attributed to contact with Egyptian territory. An epidemic that killed 2 Hittite kings in succession and reshaped the political landscape of the entire region. The skeletal evidence from the Amarna cemeteries, already showing the stress signatures of an overworked labor population, also shows mortality patterns consistent with disease moving through a community with unusual speed. Egypt was not spared. Within the royal family itself, the deaths are documented. At least 2 of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's daughters died during this period. The exact sequence is difficult to establish because the record-keeping of the late Amarna years is less complete than the earlier documentation. But the images tell the story that the texts leave incomplete. The royal family that had been depicted with 6 daughters in the intimate domestic scenes of Amarna's middle years appears with fewer children in the later imagery. Some of those daughters had grown into adults and moved into their own households. Others had simply stopped appearing. Without ceremony and without explanation, picture the night after one of those deaths. Akhenaten is in the palace. The room is lit by oil lamps, their light warm and unsteady against the painted walls. The body of his daughter has been prepared for whatever funeral rites the Aten theology permitted. And those rites were thin, because the Aten theology had not been designed with this moment in mind. There is no Osiris waiting on the other side. There is no journey through the underworld with a map. There is no weighing of the heart against the feather. There is only the absence of a child who was alive this morning and is not alive now. And a theology built entirely from light that has nothing to say about what happens when the light stops reaching a specific person. He would have prayed. He prayed every morning, every evening, in the formal ceremonies of the temple, and in whatever private language a man uses when he is alone with grief, and the theological apparatus of his own making has gone silent on him. He would have lifted his face, as he always lifted his face, toward the source that he had spent 17 years insisting was sufficient, and the source was there. The sun rose the next morning, exactly as it had always risen, filling the open courtyards of the great temple with the same light it had filled them with the day before, and the day before that, and every day since the city was built. His daughter was still gone. This is the collision at the center of the late Amarna period, and it matters more than any political calculation or diplomatic failure or administrative shortcoming. A man who built his entire theology around the sufficiency of light was living inside the evidence that light, for all its beauty and all its genuine generosity, could not do the one thing that human beings need most urgently from their gods. It could not answer the question of what happens to the people we love after they die. The traditional Egyptian religious system had an answer for this. It had many answers, elaborated over 2,000 years into one of the most comprehensive frameworks for understanding mortality that any civilization has ever produced. Osiris had died and been resurrected. The deceased could follow his path if they had the right knowledge and the right ritual preparation. The grief of loss was real, but it existed inside a structure that gave it meaning. That, said, the person you loved had gone somewhere specific and could be accompanied and supported and eventually found again. The Aten had no answer. And what did Akhenaten do with this? He did not soften the theology. He did not introduce a version of the afterlife mythology that would have given people something to hold on to when death came. He did not acknowledge, in any document that survives, the specific inadequacy of his religious vision when confronted with the human need to understand what happens to the people we love after they stop breathing. What he did was intensify. The later years of the Amarna period show a progressive hardening of the official theological program. The pressure on the remnants of the traditional religion increased rather than moderated. The imagery became more formal, more focused on the abstract relationship between the Pharaoh and the Aten, less interested in the human warmth that had characterized the early revolution. The open, generous quality of the early Aten theology, the sense that the divine light was available to everyone equally, gave way to something more exclusive, more mediated through the person of the Pharaoh himself. In the early years at Amarna, ordinary people had been depicted in the sun's rays alongside the royal family. The light touched everyone. In the later imagery, the rays increasingly terminate on the Pharaoh alone, with others receiving the divine blessing only through him, only at his mediation. The theology that had begun as a rejection of priestly intermediaries was slowly becoming a system with a single intermediary at its center. The intermediary was Akhenaten. This shift is one of the more revealing developments in the whole story, and it deserves to be understood rather than simply noted. A man who began his religious revolution by removing the middlemen between humanity and the divine ended up positioning himself as the only direct access point between humanity and the Aten. The circle closed on itself. The revolution against mediated religion produced a new form of mediated religion, with a single mediator rather than a priestly class. And that mediator was the man who had declared the need for mediators abolished. What happened between those two positions was grief, was plague, was the specific experience of a person whose theology promised sufficiency and who was learning, in the most personal possible way, that the promise had limits he had not accounted for when he made it. He could not revise the fundamental conviction. He had staked everything on the Aten. His name, his city, his family, the entire administrative and religious order of one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. He had bet the full weight of everything on the truth of what he had seen when he looked up at the sun. When the plague came, and his daughters died, and the diplomatic correspondence piled up, inadequately answered, and the people of Amarna kept their forbidden figurines hidden in their walls. The available options were limited. Revise the conviction and admit that the theology was insufficient, or press it harder. Insist more forcefully on its truth, and interpret the suffering as something other than evidence against the thing you had built. He pressed it harder. The people of Amarna continued to live inside the city he had built for them, inside the theology he had imposed on them, burying their dead with what ceremonies they could manage in a system that had not been designed to comfort the bereaved, keeping their small household gods hidden, waiting for something they probably could not have named clearly, but that had the shape, in their daily lives, of a world that was not fully meeting them where they were. In the corners of the houses, the figurines stayed hidden. Taweret, with her hippopotamus face, Bez, with his grotesque protective grimace, the small clay Isis figures that women had kept near their beds during pregnancy since before anyone could remember. All of them forbidden, all of them present, because the sun that rose every morning over the open-roofed temple, however real, and however beautiful, and however genuinely the source of everything alive, did not come into the room with you when you were frightened. It was there. It was always there. And it was not enough. Chapter 10. The men who had to keep Egypt alive. While Akhenaten was facing the sun, someone had to face everything else. This is not a criticism. It is a description of how large institutions actually function, how they have always functioned, how they must function if they are going to continue at all. A king with a vision occupies the center of the official story. The people who make sure the granaries are stocked, and the borders are patrolled, and the tax records are accurate, and the garrison at the frontier outpost gets its supply shipment, occupy the margins of that story. And the margins are where most of the actual governing happens. In the Amarna period, the margins were held by two men above all others. The first was Horemheb. Picture him on a morning in approximately year 14 of Akhenaten's reign. He is in a room in the administrative quarter of Amarna. Not the palace and not the temple, the kind of room that appears in no official imagery, because official imagery was not designed to record the work that kept Egypt from coming apart at the edges. A clay tablet has arrived from a garrison commander in the northern territories. The garrison has not received its grain allocation in 2 months. The men are managing. But the men would manage better with grain. Horemheb reads the tablet. He sets it face down on the table. He picks up a fresh tablet and begins pressing instructions into it with his stylus. He will redirect a portion of the allocation from a different storehouse. It will not be the full amount. It will be enough. He has been making these calculations for years, finding the amounts that are enough from the resources that are available, keeping the machine turning at a level of functionality that does not require the king's attention, because the king's attention is occupied with something else. He does not resent this, or if he does, he has buried the resentment deep enough that it does not interfere with the work. He is too experienced and too intelligent to let resentment slow down the calculations that Egypt requires of him every day. He sends the tablets south by courier. He picks up the next one. This is who Horemheb was during the Amarna years. Not a villain waiting for his moment. Not a secretly loyal priest of Amun biding his time. Not even a man with a developed political agenda about what should come after Akhenaten. He was a professional soldier and administrator who had spent his career learning that Egypt was held together not by theology or art or poetry, but by supply chains and garrison rotations and the patient. Unglamorous management of 1,000 details that nobody wanted to think about, but that everybody depended on. He had grown up in the system the way that career military men grow up in systems, by doing the work that the system required, by becoming indispensable to it, by learning its actual operating logic rather than its official self-description. He knew the difference between what the dispatches said and what was happening on the ground. He had the specific knowledge that comes from years of managing the gap between those two things. During the Amarna period, that gap had grown wider than anything in his experience. The defunding of the temple economy had removed a significant portion of the administrative infrastructure that Egypt depended on. The temples had not only been places of worship, they had been centers of grain storage, of record-keeping, of the distribution of resources to the workforce that kept the agricultural economy functioning. When their budgets were cut and their personnel scattered, the functions they had performed became problems that the civil and military administration had to absorb, problems that landed, eventually, on Horemheb's desk, rather than on the desk of a man composing hymns to the sun. He absorbed them. He kept the machine turning. He did not complain in any record that survives. He simply continued to do what the situation required of him, with the methodical competence of someone who has made his peace with the difference between the world as it should be and the world as it is. The second man was I, where Horemheb was the margins. I was the center. He had access to Akhenaten directly, in the way that very few people had access to a pharaoh, who had built his city partly as a way of insulating himself from the pressures of the old court. He held titles suggesting he was among the innermost circle of the Amarna administration. He was, by most scholarly estimates, either the father or a close family relation of Nefertiti, which gave him a position in the personal as well as the political life of the royal family. In his Amarna tomb, the great hymn to the Aten appears on the walls. A claimed the poem as his own, or at least as something over which he had custodial authority. Whether he composed it, compiled it, or simply had it inscribed, because proximity to the theology was a form of proximity to the power that the theology represented. We cannot determine. What we can determine is that I was a man of exceptional political intelligence who understood something that very few people at the Amarna court appear to have understood. Clearly, the revolution was a specific historical moment that had its own internal logic, and that logic was pointing toward an end that the participants in the revolution could not yet see from where they stood. He managed the present while quietly positioning himself for the future. He was present when decisions were made. He translated the theological imperatives of the revolution into the practical administrative choices that governance required day to day. He maintained relationships, carefully and without apparent disloyalty, with people across the full spectrum of Egyptian political life, people who supported the Aten theology and people who had survived it through professional adaptation, people who would be useful in whatever arrangement came after the current one. Between Horemheb managing the empire's physical machinery and A managing the court's human machinery, Egypt had what it needed to survive the Amarna period without total structural collapse. The Nile still flooded. The crops still grew. The tax system still functioned after a fashion. Trade continued. The basic machinery of a large agricultural civilization kept turning because it had too much inertia to stop quickly, even when the management at the top was focused elsewhere. But the strain was real, and it was accumulating, in the way that deferred maintenance accumulates. Invisibly at first, and then with a sudden visibility when something that has been stressed for too long finally gives. In Thebes, the priests of Amun, who had survived the disruption of their institutions, were, in their private arrangements, maintaining what knowledge and what practice they could, waiting with the patience of people who understood that institutions, older than any individual king, had outlasted difficult kings before. They were waiting for the thing that always eventually comes, the end of a reign. In Akhenaten's palace, the days continued their pattern. The morning ceremony in the open temple, the theological work, the grief that the later imagery makes visible, even if the official record does not name it, the city continuing to function at the reduced vitality of a place whose animating force is still present, but no longer fully present. The way a fire burns differently in the last hour before it goes out. He was somewhere in his 30s or early 40s. By the best estimates of the scholars who have studied his remains and his chronology, he had years ahead of him. Potentially, the plague had other ideas, or the accumulated strain of governing a civilization through a radical transformation that the civilization was not fully receiving had other ideas, or something else entirely. The historical record does not specify. What the historical record specifies is the absence. 1 year, Akhenaten is in the record. The next year, he is not. And the man in the administrative room in Amarna, the one who had been redirecting grain allocations and managing garrison rotations and keeping the machine turning while the king faced the sun, looked up from his tablet and began, carefully and without announcing what he was doing, to think about what the machine would need to keep turning now. Chapter 11. The death no one recorded. Akhenaten simply stops, not dramatically, not with the kind of ending that matches the life. There is no battle, no documented illness, no moment of crisis that the sources can point to and say, here, this is where it ended. The man who had renamed himself, renamed his city, renamed the divine order of an ancient civilization, who had carved his convictions into cliff faces and composed poetry about the nature of God and sent teams of workers across Egypt to chisel the name of Amun from every surface they could reach. That man simply ceases to appear in the historical record somewhere around his 17th year on the throne. The year is approximately 1336 BCE. The exact date is unknown. The cause of death is unknown. The location of death is unknown. The tomb prepared for him in the cliffs east of Amarna was used, or partially used, and then violated. Its contents disturbed and scattered in the chaos of the years that followed. Whether his body was ever interred there, whether it remained there, whether it was moved or deliberately destroyed during the subsequent erasure of everything associated with Amarna, is a question that decades of Egyptological research have not been able to answer with confidence. The most likely candidate for his mummy has shifted several times, as new analysis has been applied to the royal remains found in various caches over the past century and a half. A body found in tomb KV 55 in the Valley of the Kings. A young to middle-aged male with physical features showing some resemblance to the Amarna royal imagery, has been proposed and disputed and reproposed as Akhenaten's remains, with the inconclusive back and forth that characterizes much of the physical evidence from this period. The most recent analyses have suggested this individual died younger than Akhenaten's 17-year reign would seem to allow, which either means the dating of the reign is slightly off, or the body in KV 55 is someone else entirely. The question remains open. Think about what it means for a question like this to remain open. In the ancient world, the death of a pharaoh was among the most elaborately documented and ceremonially managed events that Egyptian civilization produced. The rituals of royal death had been refined over 2,000 years. The process of mummification, the funerary texts, the preparation of the tomb, the 70-day mourning period, the opening of the mouth ceremony that restored the faculties of the deceased for the afterlife, the procession to the tomb, the sealing of the burial chamber, all of it was recorded, performed, witnessed, and preserved with the specific seriousness of a civilization that believed the proper management of death was essential to the maintenance of cosmic order. For Akhenaten, essentially, none of this exists in the standard form. The absence is not accidental. It is the first layer of the erasure that would eventually become systematic. But it may also reflect something about the specific difficulty of managing the death of a pharaoh inside a theology that had not developed a coherent account of what death meant. The Aten theology had no underworld. It had no Osiris to receive the dead. It had no Book of the Dead, no navigational literature that guided the Egyptian deceased through the dangers of the passage from life to whatever came next. The official religion of Amarna was a religion of the living, of the light that sustained life. And it had no equipment for the moment when the light stopped reaching a specific body. When Akhenaten died, the priests of the Aten stood at his deathbed with a theology that was, at exactly the moment it was most needed, silent. The traditional priests were gone, their rituals officially forbidden, their knowledge dispersed. The new priests had no tradition to draw on because the tradition was 17 years old and its founder had not thought to develop a funerary practice, or had thought about it and found it incompatible with a theology whose fundamental premise was the sufficiency of light and life. What the people at his deathbed did with this problem, we do not know. There is a possibility that a small number of scholars have raised carefully, and that deserves acknowledgement without being overstated. The possibility that the manner of Akhenaten's death was not entirely straightforward, that the transition from his reign to what came after it was not simply a matter of biological death followed by normal succession, that the institutional forces represented by Horemheb and I played a role in the ending that went beyond waiting for nature to take its course. The evidence for this is not conclusive. It is the kind of evidence that consists of suspicious timing and convenient outcomes, and the general principle that when a powerful institution has been waiting a long time for something to change, the change sometimes arrives with assistance. What the evidence does support is this: the transition from Akhenaten's reign to what followed was unusually rapid and unusually complete. The ideological reversal that took place in the years immediately after his death was not the slow, contested unwinding that you would expect from a revolution that had been running for 17 years and had genuine adherents. It moved with the speed and the coordination of a process that had been planned. Someone had been thinking about how to do this before it needed to be done. The immediate succession after Akhenaten is one of the more confusing sequences in the already confusing chronology of the Amarna period. There may have been a short reign by a figure called Smenkhkare, whose identity is disputed and whose relationship to Akhenaten is unclear. There may have been a period when Nefertiti, as Nefertiti, held the throne. The sequencing has been argued over by Egyptologists for generations, and has not been resolved to general satisfaction. What is clear is that the period between Akhenaten's disappearance from the record and the accession of a child king named Tutankhaten was brief and transitional and messy in ways that the subsequent official history would do its best to smooth over. The boundary stele still stood in the cliffs around the empty city. The oath Akhenaten had carved into them was still legible. The promise not to leave, the promise to be buried here, the promise that had bound him and his family and his God and his city to this place and this vision. He had promised to stay. He did not stay. In any form that the record can confirm, the city he had sworn never to leave was already being evaluated by the people who would decide what to do with it. The open temple stood in the desert light with its offering tables thinning and its priestly staff diminished, and its theological program running on institutional inertia rather than the personal force of the man who had designed it. In the workers' village, people were beginning to understand that the calculation about whether to stay had changed. In Thebes, the priests of Amun, who had survived the disruption of their institutions, were beginning to understand that the calculation about whether it was safe to speak had also changed. And in the palace at Amarna, around a body that the official record would not properly commemorate, the men who had been keeping Egypt alive while its king faced the sun were looking at each other and beginning, carefully and without rushing, to talk about what happened next. The city had been built on a promise. The person who made the promise was gone. What remained was the oath carved in stone, the empty temple open to the sky, and the question of what a civilization does with a vision it has decided it cannot afford to keep. Chapter 12. The child who had to choose. His name, when he was born, was Tutankhaten. The last part of that name, Aten, placed him inside the theology of Amarna from the moment he entered the world. He was, by the naming convention that Akhenaten had established for his court, a child of the revolution. His very identity bound to the disk of the sun that the man, most likely his father, had placed at the center of the Egyptian universe. He was approximately 9 years old when he became Pharaoh. Let that sit for a moment. 9 years old, on the throne of the most ancient, continuous civilization on earth, inheriting not just a kingdom but a crisis, not just a crown but the accumulated consequences of 17 years of radical transformation that had reshaped the religious, economic, and administrative landscape of Egypt in ways that were still, at the moment of his accession, not fully resolved in any direction. He did not choose this. No one asked him. The question of his parentage is one of the genuinely unresolved puzzles of the period. He was almost certainly a son of Akhenaten, based on DNA analysis of his mummy compared to remains from the Amarna royal family, though the identity of his mother is disputed. Gia, a secondary wife of Akhenaten, is the most commonly proposed candidate. The implications of his parentage for how he understood his inheritance, for what he felt about the man whose theology had given him his name and whose death had given him his throne, are questions the historical record cannot answer directly. What it can answer is what he did. Within the first 2 or 3 years of his reign, while still a child, Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun, the change of a single syllable. Atentuamun, the sun disk replaced by the hidden god. The theology of the revolution replaced by the theology it had tried to displace, and with the name change came everything the name change implied. The court left Amarna and returned to Thebes. The temples of Amun and the other traditional gods were officially reopened. The resources that had been redirected to the Aten cult began flowing back toward the institutions that had administered them for centuries before Akhenaten rerouted them. A formal decree, the restoration stela, was issued in Tutankhamun's name, describing the state in which the old religion had been found and announcing the royal intention to repair it. The language of the restoration stela is worth pausing on, because it is one of the few direct windows into how the people managing this transition understood what they were doing. The text describes the temples as having fallen into ruin, the gods as having turned their backs on Egypt, the land as having been in a state of disorder, with prayers going unanswered and divine protection withdrawn. It describes Tutankhamun as the restorer, the one who has set things right, who has brought the gods back to a land that was suffering in their absence. This framing is politically calculated, designed to establish the new reign as a correction of the previous one, without explicitly condemning the previous pharaoh by name. Akhenaten is not mentioned. The Amarna period is described in terms of its consequences rather than its cause. The new king is not positioned as the son reversing his father's errors. He is positioned as the restorer of an order that had been disrupted by unnamed forces. The unnamed forces were his predecessor, his father, or the man most likely his father. Think about what it means to be 9 years old and have your identity, your name, your understanding of who you are, changed by the adults around you. Tutankhaten had been born into the theology. His name was the theology. The world he knew from his earliest memories was Amarna, the open-roofed temples, the morning ceremonies with the sun flooding the courtyards, the imagery of the royal family in the light. This was not abstract ideology for him. It was childhood. It was the smell of the morning air in the palace and the sound of the priests' voices in the temple and the way the light fell through the high windows of the rooms where he played. And then the adults who managed his reign. I and Horemheb standing behind a throne occupied by a child who could not yet hold the weight of what was being placed on him, decided that all of it needed to be set aside, that the name needed to change, that the city needed to be left, that the theology needed to be officially disavowed by the child who had been named for it. Did he understand what was being asked of him? At 9, probably not fully. Children adapt to the world. Adults create for them, because they have no alternative. They accept the reality they are placed inside as the reality, because they have no sufficient experience of other realities against which to measure it. By 12 or 13, when his awareness of himself and his situation was developing into something more coherent, he would have begun to understand. He would have been educated in the history of the office he held, in the traditions of the kingship that stretched back before Akhenaten, in the theology that the restoration stela had declared the correct one. He would have been surrounded by people who had strong reasons for wanting him to understand things in a particular way. Horemheb had been waiting for this moment for years. His continued professional service to a king whose theology he apparently did not share had been the patience of a man who understood that his usefulness, at the moment of reversal, depended on his having been present and functional. Throughout the period he intended to reverse. He was present. He was functional. And when the child king needed guidance about what the correct understanding of his inheritance was, Horemheb was there to provide it. Tutankhamun sat between these two men, a child on a throne too large for him, learning what he had inherited and what would be required to govern it. There is a detail from the excavation of his tomb that has never stopped being affecting, no matter how many times you encounter it. Howard Carter opened the tomb in 1922 and spent years documenting its contents, which were extraordinary in their completeness. Gold and jewelry and furniture and ritual objects and the artifacts of a royal life preserved in exceptional condition. Among them, mixed in with the ceremonial objects and the funerary equipment were things that belonged to a boy rather than a king. A small ivory pallet with his childhood name, Tutankhaten, still inscribed on it. Writing equipment used by a student, not a ruler. A lock of hair from his grandmother Tia, preserved in a small nested set of coffins. The kind of thing a child keeps because it belonged to someone they loved who is gone. A sling, the kind used by boys in games and target practice. Toys, they are in the Cairo Museum now, displayed alongside the gold and the grandeur, and they are quietly devastating in a way that the grandeur is not, because the grandeur is what a civilization puts on its kings. The toys are what a boy had before the civilization got to him. He died at approximately 18 or 19 years old. The cause of his death has been the subject of speculation, ranging from murder to malaria to the accumulated physical consequences of the inbreeding that characterized the Amarna royal family over several generations. The current scientific consensus, based on the most recent analysis of his remains, points toward a combination of serious health conditions, including a severe form of malaria and a fracture in his leg that may have become infected. He was not a strong young man. He had not been a strong boy. His body carried the physical legacy of a dynasty that had been too closely related for too many generations. He governed for approximately 9 to 10 years. Through his childhood and into an adolescence that did not complete itself, managing an inheritance that no one had designed for a child to carry. His tomb was small and clearly not originally intended for a king of his importance. The wall paintings were done quickly, in a style noticeably less refined than the painted tombs of more senior officials nearby. The 4 small rooms that constituted the burial complex were crowded with objects because there was not enough space to arrange them properly. He was buried by people in a hurry, because they had not expected to be doing this yet. The boy who had been named for the sun disk and renamed for the hidden god was placed in his golden coffin and sealed into his small tomb, and forgotten in the specific way that ancient Egypt forgot things, which was completely and finally, and without a marker visible from the outside. He lay there for 3,200 years. Then a man named Howard Carter, working on a theory and refusing to give up on it, found the steps leading down to the sealed door, and the boy king, the child who had been asked to undo a revolution he was too young to have participated in, who had been renamed by adults who needed him to be something specific, who had played with a sling and kept a lock of his grandmother's hair and died before he was 20, came back into the light that his father had named him for, the light that his father's successors had renamed him away from, the light that had been there all along, indifferent to the arguments of the people beneath it, still there, as it always had been. Chapter 13. The Pharaoh Egypt tried to erase. Horemheb became Pharaoh in approximately 1319 BCE. He was not young when he took the throne. He had spent the better part of his adult life in the service of kings he outlived, managing the practical machinery of an empire through one of the most disruptive periods in its history, waiting with the patience of a man who understood that the moment he had been preparing for required the right conditions, and that rushing the conditions would ruin the moment. The conditions were now right. What followed was not a purge in the conventional sense. There were no public trials, no executions of Amarna loyalists, no dramatic ceremonies of repudiation in which the revolution was formally condemned and its participants punished. Horemheb was too experienced and too intelligent for that kind of theatre. Dramatic repudiations create martyrs, and martyrs create movements. And the last thing Horemheb wanted was a movement organized around the memory of what he was trying to make people forget. He wanted something more total and more permanent than punishment. He wanted Akhenaten to have never existed. The mechanism he used was the same one that Akhenaten had used against Ammon, applied now in reverse, and with the additional weight of institutional determination behind it. He sent workers across Egypt with chisels and with plaster and with the administrative authority of the crown, and they began the systematic removal of Akhenaten from the record of Egyptian history. The name came first. Every inscription, every monument, every official document that contained the name Akhenaten was targeted. The name was chiseled out of stone surfaces where it appeared. Where chiseling would damage the surrounding inscription, plaster was applied over it, hiding the name beneath a layer of material that could be carved with something more acceptable. In places where the name was too deeply integrated into the surrounding text to remove cleanly, the entire passage was sometimes eliminated. The images followed. The distinctive elongated figure of the Amarna style, which had been carved and painted across the walls of temples and palaces and official buildings throughout Egypt during the 17 years of the revolution, was defaced. Faces were chiseled off. Cartouches containing royal names were cut away. In some cases, entire relief panels were removed from their original contexts and repurposed, turned face inward to serve as fill material inside new construction. The images hidden inside the very walls of the monuments being built to replace what they represented. This last detail is worth holding. Blocks carved with the faces of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, with scenes of the royal family under the rays of the Aten, with the artistic program of the most radical religious experiment in Egyptian history, were not destroyed. They were incorporated, face down or face in, into the foundations and fill of new structures at Karnak and Hermopolis. They became the hidden bones of buildings dedicated to the gods they had been made to replace. Archaeologists found them there centuries later, and the discovery changed everything that was known about the period. Because the blocks had been protected by their enclosure, they survived in better condition than almost anything left exposed. The erasure had preserved what it intended to destroy. The official king lists of Egypt, the documents that recorded the sequence of legitimate rulers in the proper order, were revised. The Abydos king list, carved under Seti I and listing the legitimate pharaohs of Egypt from the earliest dynasties forward, moves directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, 17 years of Akhenaten's reign, followed by the brief reigns of Smenkhkare and Neferuaten, followed by 10 years of Tutankhamun, followed by the brief reign of Ai. All of it simply does not appear. The list jumps, as if the gap between Amenhotep III and Horemheb contained nothing worth listing. Tutankhamun, the child king, who had officially reversed the revolution and restored the traditional order, was not considered sufficiently legitimate to appear on the list of kings. His association with Amarna, even as its dismantler, contaminated him in the official memory. The revolution had touched him, and the touching was enough. The city itself was addressed last, and the way it was addressed tells you more about the Egyptian understanding of what needed to happen than anything else in the erasure. Amarna was not burned. There was no deliberate demolition, no act of official violence against the buildings, no ceremony of repudiation in which the city was officially cursed and its stones scattered. What happened was quieter and in some ways more complete. It was simply left. The population was encouraged or instructed to relocate, to return to Thebes or Memphis or the provincial cities they had come from, to resume the lives they had interrupted when the court moved to the desert. The administrative functions of the government moved back to Thebes. The temples were emptied of their personnel and their operating funds. The palace was stripped of its portable contents, and then the doors were closed, or left open, and the people walked out. And the desert began the process it has been conducting ever since. Sand moved in through the open doorways. Wind carried it across the floors and deposited it in corners. The mud brick walls, no longer maintained, began the slow collapse that mud brick undergoes when the humans who made it stop paying attention to it. The painted plaster on the interior walls, which had shown scenes of birds and fish and the natural world in the distinctively free style of Amarna art, began to flake and fall. The great temple stood open to the sky, as it had always stood open to the sky. But now the opening was not a theological statement. It was simply a roof that had never been built. And the sky it was open to had no particular interest in what was happening beneath it. The city that Akhenaten had sworn to never leave became, within a generation, a place that Egyptians did not go. Now consider what the erasure was actually doing, because this is where the Egyptian logic of the operation becomes visible. And the Egyptian logic is more interesting than the political logic. Horemheb and the officials who designed the erasure were not primarily trying to protect their political interests, though they were doing that too. They were not primarily trying to prevent a revival of the Aten cult, though they may have been doing that as well. They were doing something that made sense only inside the Egyptian understanding of history, of legitimacy, and of what it meant for the universe to be in correct order. They were repairing Ma'at. In the Egyptian worldview, the legitimate sequence of pharaohs was not simply a political record, it was a cosmological one. The proper succession of kings was part of the structure that held the universe in its correct configuration. A break in that succession, a king who had ruled outside the proper divine order, was not just a historical anomaly. It was a tear in the fabric of reality that needed to be closed. By removing Akhenaten from the king lists, they were not falsifying history in the modern sense of deliberate deception. They were correcting the cosmological record to reflect what should have been true, which, in Egyptian thinking, was in some sense more real than what had actually happened. Akhenaten had ruled outside Ma'at. A rule outside Ma'at was not a real rule in the sense that mattered. Therefore, it did not belong in the list of real rules. The erasure was not a cover-up. It was a repair. This distinction matters because it changes how you understand what the people doing the erasing believed they were doing. They were restoring the proper order of things, filling in the gap that a disruptive king had torn in the fabric of the official account of reality. Whether they were right about what reality required is a different question. The workers with the chisels did not ask that question. They were given a task and they performed it with the thoroughness that the Egyptian administrative tradition brought to every task it undertook. They worked systematically, moving from monument to monument, surface to surface, name to name, and in the desert, the sand continued to move. The boundary stelae stood in the cliffs, their texts still legible in places, the oath still carved into the stone, the oath of a man who had promised never to leave. Preserved in the rock of the place, he promised never to leave. Long after everyone who heard the promise and everyone who witnessed its violation was dust, the workers with the chisels came to some of the boundary stelae too. The faces were chiseled off. The cartouches were cut away. The oath was damaged, but not fully removed. Because the stelae were cut into the living rock of the cliffs and could not be easily destroyed without more effort than the operation apparently allocated to them. The oaths remained. Partially, in the form of scars where the names had been, in the shape of the absence. Here is the thing about erasure that the people who perform it almost never account for, because accounting for it would undermine the entire purpose of the operation. Erasure leaves a record of itself. The hacked surface where a name used to be is evidence that a name was there. The gap in the king list draws attention to the gap. The blocks turned face inward inside the walls of new temples create, when discovered, a map of exactly what was being hidden, the very thoroughness of the operation, the systematic nature of it, the fact that it was applied so consistently across so many surfaces in so many places, tells the archaeologist or historian who comes later that whatever was here was considered dangerous enough to pursue this carefully. You do not spend that much effort erasing something unimportant. The magnitude of the erasure is a monument to the magnitude of what it was erasing. And 3,000 years after Horemheb's workers put down their chisels, a woman digging in a field near the site of the abandoned city put her hand into the earth and found the clay tablets that the erasure had not reached, because they had already been underground when the erasure happened. The letters that Ribhadda had written and that the court had inadequately answered, the record of a world that had kept going regardless of what was happening in the open-roofed temple at the center of the city. The erasure had not reached them. The sand had protected them, and the man whose name had been chiseled from every accessible surface in Egypt, whose face had been removed from every reachable monument, whose city had been left for the desert, whose death had not been recorded, and whose body had not been found, was still there. In the clay, in the stone, in the scar-shaped evidence of every surface from which his name had been removed, still there, still asking the question that the erasure had been designed to close. Was Egypt erasing a man, or repairing a universe? The answer, 3,000 years later, is that it was trying to do both, and that trying to do both turned out to be impossible. You can repair a universe on paper. You can correct the king list and plaster over the cartouches and turn the carved blocks face inward and let the sand bury the city and call the whole period a gap in the legitimate sequence of divine rulers. But the universe itself keeps the record, in the shape of what is missing, in the questions that the missing shape generates. In the 3,500 years of historians and archaeologists and theologians and ordinary curious people who have looked at the scar where the name used to be and asked what was here, the erasure did not answer that question. It was the question. Chapter 14. The question that would not die. What happened to the idea? Because the idea, unlike the city and unlike the name, did not require stone to survive. Ideas move through the ancient world in ways that leave no clear paper trail. Carried by merchants and diplomats and refugees and priests and the general movement of people across borders that were more permeable than later historical narratives suggest. The Bronze Age Near East was not a collection of sealed civilizations developing in isolation. It was a network, connected by trade routes and diplomatic marriages, and the slow diffusion of language and religious imagery that characterizes any region where people have been in contact for centuries. In that network, the question Akhenaten had pressed into the official record of his civilization with the full force of royal authority did not simply evaporate when the official record was corrected. Consider what the scholars found when they placed the great hymn to the Aten next to a Hebrew text written several centuries later. Psalm 104 describes the world in a way that stops you when you have recently read the great hymn. Both texts open with the majesty of divine light. Both describe the rhythm of day and night, activity and rest. As their structural spine, both catalogue the creatures of field and forest and sea with an attention that feels almost scientific in its comprehensiveness. Both locate the source of all life in a single divine power whose generosity sustains every living thing without condition or preference. The parallels are not vague thematic similarities, of the kind that arise when two poets independently describe the same natural world. They are specific enough, and numerous enough, and arranged in similar enough sequence that generations of scholars have asked whether there is a direct relationship between the two texts. The honest answer remains that no one knows. The channels through which ideas traveled in the Bronze Age Near East were complex and imperfectly documented. The Canaanite city-states that appear in the Amarna letters, the same city-states whose rulers were writing to Akhenaten while his theology was taking shape, were in continuous contact with the populations from which the Hebrew tradition would eventually emerge. The theological ideas circulating in Egypt during the Amarna period were available, in some form, to anyone moving through that part of the world in the subsequent centuries. Whether that availability produced the specific connection visible in the two texts, whether a Hebrew poet centuries later was working with imagery that had its roots in the open-roofed temple at Amarna, whether the question Akhenaten asked about one source found its way into the tradition that would eventually reshape the religious imagination of half the human beings on earth. These questions cannot be answered with the confidence that the evidence requires for a definitive claim. What can be said is that the question was asked in Egypt in the 14th century BCE, and that it appears again, in a recognizable form, in a tradition that developed in the same region in the subsequent centuries. The appearance is too specific to dismiss as coincidence, and too uncertain to claim as proof. The question traveled. How far? And through what channels? And in what form? The record does not say clearly enough to satisfy anyone who needs clarity. Now, consider a room in London in 1938. The man sitting at the desk is 82 years old. His name is Sigmund Freud. He is dying of cancer of the jaw, in a level of daily pain that would have ended the working life of a less determined person years earlier. He was driven out of Vienna that June, after the annexation of Austria, by a regime that had decided his people were not people in the sense that entitled them to remain in the cities where they had lived for generations. He left at 81 years old, carrying what could be carried, leaving behind the city where he had built everything he had built. He is in London now, in a house in Hampstead, in pain, in exile, in the last year of his life, and he is writing about Akhenaten. The book is called Moses and Monotheism, and its argument is that Moses was an Egyptian, a follower of Akhenaten, who took the Aten theology to the people who would eventually develop it into Judaism, and through Judaism, into Christianity and Islam. The argument is not accepted by mainstream scholarship. The evidence is insufficient. The historical reconstruction, too, speculative. Freud was applying psychological methodology to a historical question, and the result shows the seams of that misapplication. But set the argument aside and ask the other question. Why this? Why does a man, at the end of his life, in pain, in exile, watching the tradition he belongs to being used as justification for persecution, choose to spend his remaining energy on the question of where monotheism came from? Why does the thread he follows lead back, through all the centuries and all the scholarship available to him, to a Pharaoh who built a city in the desert and was erased from the official record 3,500 years before Freud picked up his pen? Because the question Akhenaten asked was still alive, not because anyone had preserved it deliberately, but because the question itself was the kind that keeps returning, that refuses to stay settled. that appears in new forms in new centuries, because the thing it is asking about is still there. What is behind all of this? Is there one source? Is the light that falls on the child in Egypt, and the child in Babylon, and the child in the country, whose name no one knows, the same light, in a way that means something about the nature of the power behind it? Akhenaten answered this question with a sun disk, and an open-roofed temple, and a theology that could not survive his death, because it was too dependent on his presence, and too silent on the things that human beings need their gods to address. When the light goes out on a specific person they love. The Akhetaten was not the answer. But the question was the question, and the question, unlike the city and unlike the name, could not be chiseled out of the record, because the question was not carved in stone. It was carved in the structure of how human minds encounter the world, in the specific capacity that human beings have, and apparently have always had, to look at everything and ask whether there is one thing behind it. What Akhenaten did was ask it louder, and more publicly, and with more power behind it, than anyone before him had asked it. He asked it with an army of workers and a new city and a revised budget, and a theology and a poem, and 17 years of the most concentrated royal authority the ancient world had yet seen. He asked it in a way that left marks, in the stone where his name was chiseled away, in the clay tablets that survived underground, in the blocks turned face inward in the walls of Karnak, in the parallel passages of a poem and a psalm separated by centuries, in the final book of a dying man in exile who could not leave the question alone. Freud died in September of 1939, 1 month after the war that would confirm everything he had feared began. He did not live to know whether his argument would be accepted. He knew it probably would not be. He wrote it anyway, because the question was still there, and he was still the kind of person who could not leave a question alone, and at the end of a life spent asking what lies underneath what human beings present on the surface. This was the question that remained. Where did the idea of one source come from? He traced it back to a man in a desert city who looked up at the sun one morning and believed, completely and without reservation, that what he was seeing was the truth. He was not the last person to follow that thread back to the same place. He will not be the last. The question does not expire. It only waits for the next person who cannot leave it alone. Go back to the beginning. Byblos, 1345 BCE. Rib-Hadar is pressing his stylus into wet clay, writing the letter he has written before, asking for the help that is not coming. The sun is rising over the harbour. The walls of the city are holding. For now, the messenger is waiting by the door. He does not know how the story ends. None of them did. Not Rib-Hadar, writing into the silence of a court, too absorbed in its own transformation to respond with the urgency his situation required. Not the stonemason in Thebes who arrived one morning to find the temple storehouse running short, who adapted as people without institutional leverage always adapt, quietly, and without anyone writing it down. Not the priests of Amun waiting in whatever private arrangements they had made, understanding that the calculation about whether to speak had not yet changed, but believing, correctly, that it eventually would. Not Nefertiti, standing in the open courtyard of the great temple with her face in the light, building the visual language of a revolution she did not know would outlast her presence in it. Not the workers whose bones in the Amarna cemetery show the compression fractures of people who carried too much weight for too long, who built the city of the sun god, and left their physical evidence in the ground, while the theological argument raged above them. Not Tutankhamun, 9 years old, on a throne not built for a child, holding a sling in a palace, being systematically emptied of everything it had been. Not Horemheb, patient and practical, and completely certain that the world he was defending was worth defending. Sending his workers out with chisels to correct a record that had gone wrong. Not Freud. 82 years old, in a house in Hampstead. In pain. In exile. Following a thread that led back 3,500 years to a man in a desert city who looked up at the sun and believed he had seen the truth. None of them could see what we can see, which is the whole shape of the thing from outside it. From outside it, the shape is this. A man with genuine conviction and genuine power tried to rebuild one of the greatest civilizations in human history around a single visible truth. He had the intelligence to see the truth clearly. He had the will to pursue it completely. He had the authority to demand that an entire civilization reorganize itself around what he had seen. What he did not have was the thing that no amount of intelligence or will or authority can supply. He did not have the ability to make other people need what he needed. The stonemason needed bread. The priest of Osiris needed a framework for understanding what happened to the people he loved after they died. The woman going into labor needed Taweret, the familiar hippopotamus goddess who had been in the room at every birth in her family for as long as anyone could remember, whose presence felt like protection in a way that a sun disk with rays ending in small hands did not. The vassal king in Byblos needed soldiers, or gold, or at minimum a letter that acknowledged his situation before his walls came down. The Aten was real, in the sense that the sun is real, in the sense that the observation Akhenaten made about the unity of its light was a genuine observation about something that exists. The poem he wrote about it is beautiful in a way that has not diminished across 3,500 years. But beauty is not the same as sufficiency. Consider where the pieces ended up. The city is a field of low mounds in central Egypt. Its mud brick walls dissolved back into the earth from which they were made. Its painted plaster fallen. Its great open temple marked only by foundation stones, visible at certain angles, in certain lights. Tourists visit on a good day and find it underwhelming, because the things that made it extraordinary were the things that did not survive. The paint and the people and the theological certainty of the man who built it, the boundary stelae are still in the cliffs, damaged, their faces chiseled away, their cartouches cut out. But the text around the damage is still legible in places. The oath is still there, partially, the words of a man who promised never to leave, preserved in the rock of the place he promised never to leave. Long after everyone who heard the promise, and everyone who witnessed its breaking, is dust. The Amarna letters are in museums across the world, scattered across the institutions of a modernity that would have been incomprehensible to every person whose words they contain. Rib Hadda's letters are there, still urgent, still specific, still the voice of a man trying to make someone pay attention before it was too late. Nobody answered them then. Scholars answer them now. The bust is in Berlin. It sits in room 210 of the Neues Museum, in a purpose-built display case, under lighting designed to emphasize the planes of the face and the quality of the craftsmanship. The face looks straight ahead, one eye complete, with its inlaid iris and its direct gaze, looking at whoever stands in front of it with the specific presence that great portraiture maintains across any distance of time, one eye socket empty, the hollow waiting for an inlay that was never inserted, the finished surface of the stone around it, making the absence more visible rather than less. The sculptor left his workshop at the end of Amarna and did not come back. The bust remained in the sand for 3,200 years, in the condition it was in when he left it, unfinished. One side complete and one side waiting. Egypt has asked for it back. Germany has said no. The conversation continues without resolution, which means the face continues to look out from behind glass in Berlin, while the argument about where it belongs plays out in a language that neither the sculptor nor the woman who originally commissioned it would recognize. The face does not weigh in on the argument. It looks straight ahead, present and composed and attending to something that is not in the frame of any camera or the field of vision of any visitor standing before it. The sun rose over Amarna this morning, as it rose over the field of low mounds where the city used to be, as it rose over the museum in Berlin and the museum in Cairo and the Valley of the Kings where the boy king lay in his golden coffin for 3,200 years. It rose without being asked. It rose without a theology to justify it, or a priesthood to maintain it, or a pharaoh to serve as the official channel between its light and the people who needed it. It rose because that is what it does. Akhenaten saw this. He saw it clearly. He saw it completely. He built a city and wrote a poem and changed his name and sent workers with chisels across an ancient civilization to carve his seeing into the permanent record, and then he died. And the record was corrected, and the city was left for the sand, and the name was removed from every surface his successors could reach. And the sun rose anyway, the morning after the last ceremony in the great temple. The morning after, the last family packed their belongings and walked out of Amarna toward the river. The morning after, Horemheb's workers finished with their chisels and moved on to the next monument. The morning after he was gone, as he had always said it would. He knew that the light did not need him. It never had. It was there before the first god was named, and it will be there after. The last one is forgotten, and it asked nothing of the man who looked up at it one morning and decided that it was enough. It was enough. It was always enough. It just was not enough for everyone else. And that distance between what he saw and what the world around him needed, between the sufficiency of the light and the insufficiency of a theology built only from light, between the vision that was genuinely seeing something and the civilization that genuinely could not live inside that vision alone. That distance is where Akhenaten lived, fully, in the open temple, in the morning light, with his face lifted and his conviction intact, and the world outside his city's boundaries continuing to be the complicated, grieving, frightened, bread-kneading, turret-keeping world that it had always been, and that no sun disk, however real, however beautiful, however genuinely the source of everything alive, was going to change by itself. He looked up. The light was there. It is still there. He was right about that part. He was only wrong about how much it was enough.